Lab at William & Mary Law School. She's a faculty affiliate with the Global Research Institute in Data Science at William & Mary and a research affiliate with Penn State's University Institute for Computational and Data Sciences. Her research focuses on the intersection of civil rights, national security, cyber surveillance, and AI. She is an author of several notable works, including Biometrics and an AI Bill of Rights. She's the editor of Pandemic Surveillance, Privacy, Security, and Ethics. She previously served as Special Policy Counsel in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. Samir Jain is the Vice President of Policy at the Center for Democracy and Technology, CDT. He leads CDT's policy advocacy and manages CDT's core policy teams in conjunction with its CEO. His work includes shaping and overseeing execution of CDT's policy agenda and strategy and representing the organization before policymakers, regulatory agencies, civil society, industry, and the media. Samir has 25 years of experience in senior roles in government and private practice, working at the forefront of technology law, policy, and regulation. He served in the Obama administration as Associate Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice and as Senior Director of Cybersecurity Policy for the National Security Council. In those positions, he advised leadership at the White House and DOJ on cybersecurity and technology policy. Samir was also a partner at the law firm of Wilmer Hill, which is where I started my legal career back in the dark ages, or the dinosaur age, and at Jones Day. He started his career as a communications lawyer and worked on regulatory and litigation matters ranging from net neutrality to electronic surveillance. So there is this through line in terms of your career engagement and activities. In this moment, when we're facing one of the most critical elections in our history, it's really important to have a conversation about AI and democracy. So thank you both for coming. Turn it over to you, Margaret.
Great. Thank you so much to Trina, Gio, everyone for inviting us here for this very important conversation. And this moment in history is so critical. We are now 6.5 weeks away from Election Day, November 5th. And so I can't imagine a topic more timely than this. So AI elections and AI and democracy, I think that we have in these last couple of weeks seen it come into sharp relief of the types of ways in which AI systems and disinformation and misinformation campaigns can be felt disproportionately on certain communities, the types of communities that are now the focus of this dialogue today. So we have, for example, the false allegations of those immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, of stealing and eating pets. And we know that they are legal immigrants here on temporary protected status. We also saw with the 2020 election, Ruby Freeman, Shay Moss, for example, being targeted unfairly, facing death threats, and now being successful in their litigation of defamation claims. We saw that with the 2016 presidential election, the targeting of certain communities in order to sow discord and try to exacerbate racial discrimination in this United States with the Internet Research Agency and the Mueller report. And we saw also the encouraging of Black voters to stay at home, not vote, or vote by text in order to try to subvert their voices. And then, of course, January 6th. And with many of you, I'm sure, as it did with me, it shook me to my core. And it led me into a journey where I started studying the Civil War very intensely. Given that there were so many historians that were drawing a historical analog between 1859, 1860, 1861, and our current day. And so I think that, as we think about these AI systems and their impacts on election and democracy, that it's important for us to take stock of the enduring impact of these information warfare, disinformation, and misinformation campaigns, including what has been referred to as the big lie. So many of you have seen some of the recent polls that show that a third of the nation believes that the 2020 election was stolen, that you have approximately 52 Republicans after the 2020 election believing that Trump had legitimately won the election, and that in one poll, even if Trump conceded and lost all of his challenges, 40% of the voters polled said that they would continue to believe that Biden was illegitimate, regardless of the evidence. So I wanted to say all that to help set the stage for our conversation with Samir Jain, somebody who I've had the privilege to work very closely with over these last couple of years, and it's been such an honor to work together with you.
Likewise.
Such a leader in this area. And so I wanted to make sure that we first set the table and understand some of the background of these AI governance developments over the last few years, and wanted to make sure that the audience understands that we are really truly in a watershed moment when we are looking at AI and the law as a field, as it is breaking before our very eyes. So could you help us understand how this administration has been specifically approaching AI governance generally, including the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, the National Institute of Standards and Technology AI Risk Management Framework, and other types of developments?
Sure. Let me begin by thanking you for doing this panel, and then to the folks at Duke for organizing this conference. I appreciate the opportunity. I think when we think about AI regulation in this administration and how this administration has focused on AI, really the foundational document is the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which I think laid the foundation of some basic core principles and values that you see as a through line throughout subsequent developments, both in the administration and to the extent there's been legislation on the legislative side. So, you see things that focus on discrimination, on privacy, on safety and effectiveness of the systems, on transparency, on the notion of having an explanation, the involvement of humans in the loop. So some of those very basic ideas, are set in the AI Bill of Rights, and a lot of the story of what happens then subsequently, certainly in the United States, is how do you take those principles and actually encode them into law, operationalize them, and things like that. So that's, I think, one foundational document. I think a second foundational document, which I'm not sure we've referred to so much today, is the risk management framework that was put forward by the National Institute of Science and Technology and the Department of Commerce, which is a document that's intended to help private sector actors primarily, although also government actors, figure out how do we manage risk. And here you start to see the notions of doing audits and assessments to identify what the risks are, what risks are being posed by particular AI systems, and then how do you manage those risks? What are the questions that should be asked? It's not a document that I think sets forth values in the same way that the Bill of Rights does, so much as it tries to say, okay, here's a framework for how do you actually deal with the risks that are arising from a particular AI system. And then the third sort of layer that I'd put on it, because we see it so frequently in this administration, is the notion of voluntary commitments. We see over and over again, including a year ago with some of the big AI companies, basically agreeing with the White House to certain commitments, in the absence of any laws being passed, that the companies agreed to, certain things that they would do or agree to do. We'll get into this. There's certainly a lot of weaknesses in the use of voluntary commitments instead of regulation or other approaches, but it nonetheless, I think, has become a little bit characteristic of the way the administration has approached AI governance, particularly in the absence of laws.
Great, thank you. And then what are you seeing as far as other developments at the federal legislative level and state legislation?
So on the federal side, we've got a dysfunctional Congress. I don't think I anticipate any, general AI framework coming out of Congress anytime soon. Senator Schumer, along, with a bipartisan group, put out some framework ideas. The House, I think, is going to release a report by the end of this year. But I don't think any of those are going to lead to any kind of generalized approach to AI regulation. Now, you might see, very specific types of legislation. So, for example, the Defiance Act, which creates a civil cause of action for the creation of non-consensual intimate imagery, has passed through the Senate unanimously. It's pending in the House. It wouldn't surprise me if that passed. Or you might see things like the Create AI Act, which tries to create government data, aggregate data that researchers and others can have access to. So you might see some very targeted things at the federal level, but you're not going to see, I think, anytime soon, a more general AI regulatory framework. Now, that does contrast to some degree with what's going on in the states, where the states are stepping up to some degree in the absence of federal action. Probably the best example of this is the statute passed in Colorado, which does put in place a framework for governing and regulating what it calls high-risk AI systems, which are primarily those that are involved in consequential decision-making, hiring, who gets a loan, education. And in that context, it puts in place certain obligations, again, really a through line from the Bill of Rights in terms of doing risk assessments, having to mitigate some of those risks, some versions of transparency and the like. And so that is probably the closest thing we have in the United States to sort of a general AI regulatory regime. Even that is now up for debate again, because even though it was passed into law, as part of the deal that was made, there's now a task force that's re-examining that law and see, are there modifications that should be made? We're part of that task force, but there are a lot of industry people that are part of that task force as well. So it remains to be seen before it goes into effect, whether it gets weakened or strengthened.
Great, thank you so much. And there's been so much in the headlines about the European Union AI Act. It was published in the EU's official journal in July and then went into force on August 1st of this year. But there have been so many other global developments in China and in many other nations, and was wondering if you could help introduce us to some of those developments.
Yeah, and I do think this is an important perspective, because I think it's a mistake to think of AI regulation only from a domestic standpoint, because there is a lot of development going on internationally. There's a lot of attempts to coordinate internationally as well. And the reality is certainly when you're talking about the big companies, they have to deal with the international law. And some of the practices they put in place to comply with international law are inevitably going to filter back to the United States. So as you mentioned, the big law obviously is the EU AI Act, which takes what essentially a risk-based approach. It sort of classifies AI systems into different tiers. It says certain AI systems are unacceptable. They pose unacceptable risks. So real-time remote biometric identification, for example, is something that's called out in the AI Act as posing an unacceptable risk, meaning you can't use it. Then there are sort of high-risk systems, which can include certain law enforcement systems, includes a lot of the consequential decision type systems. And there's a fairly robust set of governance requirements, again, similar to what we were talking about, I was talking about in Colorado in terms of risk assessment, mitigation of risks, transparency, and the like. And so that's what's going on in the EU. Interestingly, you mentioned China. On paper, China actually has one of the strictest regulatory regimes around AI in the world. I mean, it even goes so far as, for example, to regulate the use of AI to schedule workers in a very specific context. We were talking about workers earlier. And so on paper, it actually has a very strict regime. But we also know in China, what's written on paper doesn't necessarily reflect what goes on in practice, or it's certainly heavily influenced by the government and what the government chooses to do. So the regime on paper is interesting, but how it works in practice may be a different matter. And I think a lot of it, when you dig into it, is really about information control and the government being able to control, for example, what gets produced through generative AI type systems. And then, as I mentioned, there are efforts through the UN, through OECD, through what's called, through the G7 and these various international bodies to coordinate some types of AI regulation and arrive at a common set of principles. And, it's made some progress. I think, how enforceable and how much force those will have remains to be seen. But nonetheless, I think there's more international coordination and discussion around the regulation of AI, for example, than there ever was around social media back, 20 years ago.
Let's now turn to more of a deep dive into the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. and some of the other developments in policy in this administration that flowed from that effort by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So the Bill of Rights, as all of you know, followed the U.S. Constitution, and we had first the embodiment of separation of powers and a division of power structurally, both horizontally and vertically, in our U.S. constitutional scheme. But then the Bill of Rights was seen as necessary for us to try to embody a certain type of philosophical commitment to both positive rights and negative rights. And Brandon, in the panel before, your question about what about the Bill of Rights before we think about the AI Bill of Rights, I think is an important one, because I think that there have been many questions about how do we bridge the gap between the principles of the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights and operationalizing these on the ground. And I think that that question is particularly important when we think about the pre-existing legal commitments that we have, including our current Bill of Rights. And I think that what is very interesting is the way in which we can marry the conversation between the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights and also the executive order that followed the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. So on October 30th, you saw the White House issue the executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence. And then that was followed by the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, their memo on advancing governance, innovation, and risk management for agency use of artificial intelligence on March 28th of this year. And I think that we see an approach that follows very similarly in many ways with the EU's approach of a principles-based or a rights-based and risk-based hybrid approach, but would love to hear your thoughts more about the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that the question that really arose in the aftermath of the Bill of Rights is, okay, those values make sense, but how do we actually translate those values into action and into governance around AI and the development and deployment of AI? And I think, as you noted, Margaret, the executive order, and more particularly in some ways the OMB memo, I think is an attempt to do that. So the OMB memo is meant to put in place governance regulations around the government's own use of AI, with the exception of national security, which gets carved out into a different memo that will come someday. But for civilian agencies, at least, non-national security agencies, I think it's actually an attempt to operationalize the Bill of Rights and to put forth, okay, how do we make sure that privacy is protected, that AI systems used by the government don't discriminate? And so it puts in place a variety of mechanisms, everything from requiring every agency to inventory and publish an inventory of the AI systems that they're using so that we in the public can actually know what it is that they're doing. It puts in place governance mechanisms. So every agency has to have a chief AI officer and various other kinds of requirements as to who is responsible for the use of AI by that agency, as well as coordination across the government among those chief AI officers. Then it isolates, in particular, what the OMB memo calls rights impacting or safety impacting systems. So AI systems that affects people's rights, such as in the law enforcement context, or affects people's safety. And it says as to those, it puts in place a fairly detailed governance regime, everything from the kinds of impact and assessments that we've been talking about, risk mitigation requirements, and the like. And so the OMB memo, I think, is the best example we have, certainly of the administration's view as to how you actually operationalize the Bill of Rights.
Great, thank you so much. I think that what is really critical for many people to try to understand when conceptualizing AI governance are these principles, and leading with principles or leading with a framework of rights first before we get into the nitty-gritty details of how to implement those principles. And so, as you explained, the principles for the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights included safe and effective systems, protection against algorithmic discrimination, data privacy, notice and explanation, and human in the loop or human oversight protections. And I was wondering whether or not you saw these as a new way of looking at rights-based governance and that we then need to operationalize from there, Or do we need to view this as more of a risk-based system where we can look at, for example, tort and contract liability regimes as a better and more effective way to operationalize these rights and principles?
I mean, I think to some degree, at least for now, it's going to be a little bit of an all of the above type of approach, right? Because I think there is the operationalization question, sort of how do you translate these abstract rights into actual actions? But then there is the question of liability or enforceability, like how do you enforce those and make sure that they actually are meaningful in that sense? Because without the enforcement piece, then you both don't have the deterrence and the on the part of the developers and deployers of AI, as well as not actually providing compensation or recompense to people who are harmed. And so I think we're very early stages, I think, in the United States of trying to figure that out. To some degree, right now, I think by default, we're relying on contract, on tort, on intellectual property law, general privacy laws to the extent they apply. But I think there remains a question of, I think Colorado starts to answer this a little bit. But I think the question of how we're going to enforce them and what liability is going to look like, and really who is liable to, I think, is a difficult question in the AI context. Because if you think of generative AI, for example, you may have one entity that creates or develops the training data, another entity that develops the general AI model, just another entity that creates an application on top of that model, and another entity yet still who deploys that in a particular context. And how you allocate responsibility across that whole stack, who's responsible for what, who's liable for what, is actually a really difficult question. And it's not, I think, anything that anyone's really grappled with yet in terms of our laws.
Yeah, I think that part of the challenge really is that so much of the power resides with these private companies that are creating the AI systems. Particularly now we see the power tilting very heavily in the big tech companies with generative AI. And you have with the National Institute of Standards and Technology AI risk management framework, a cooperative effort where they're asking companies, for example, to voluntarily agree to the types of mitigation and types of risk management proposals that they are setting forth, including for audit and assessment purposes. And when setting up these AI risk compliance systems, I know that you have many questions about what is the best way to approach this. And what do you think are some of the greatest challenges and the greatest promises of this type of voluntary system of risk management?
So I think, I've been talking about operationalization, and I've sort of left it to the audits and assessments and said that's a way to operationalize it. And we've heard about audits and assessments a lot today. But I think what we need to recognize is that we actually don't know how to do audits and assessments properly for AI systems yet. There's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we don't even know how to do the basics of, like we don't know how to measure. Like we all agree that AI systems shouldn't be biased. We have no way of take two AI systems and measure which one is more biased than the other. I mean, you can do testing, you can produce biased results, but if you want a systematic measurement of this system is less biased and so we should use this instead of this system, we don't know how to do that. And so the science of measurement around AI is very much nascent. The question of audits is unclear, like who should do these audits? Presumably they should be independent. You don't want the developer themselves to doing those audits because that is clearly self-interested. But then who has the expertise to do those audits? Civil society and those entities like us, we don't have that expertise. You could turn to the Ernst & Youngs and those kinds of auditors. But A, if they're being hired by the company, it's not really clear they're independent. B, if you think about it in the financial context, how do audits work? You have a set of accepted principles like the GAAP principles, and what does an auditor do? They look at a company's practices and compare their practices against those accepted set of principles. In the AI context, we don't have the accepted set of principles yet. So what does an auditor do when they look at the AI developers' practices or deployers' practices? We don't know yet. And so even though I think audits and assessments conceptually make a lot of sense, and it's sort of the fallback that everyone points to, there's a lot of work left to be done. And NIST, I think, is trying to do some of that work. The AI Safety Institute, that's part of NIST, is trying, I think one of their tasks really is to develop the science of measurement around AI. But there's a lot of work still to be done before we get to a place of being able to do that properly.
Yeah, similarly with the issue that this is largely a self-governance model in the absence of some type of omnibus federal comprehensive legislation around AI, many corporations are adopting what they are promoting as AI ethics models within their own corporate infrastructure. And I was wondering whether you could speak to the benefits and the challenges of that model.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a good thing that companies are thinking about this and putting in place principles and practices, right? We certainly don't want them ignoring these issues. And so I think it's something to be encouraged. And it's good that they're engaging with NIST and with other regulators. And frankly, certainly in today's world, they have a lot of the expertise and knowledge that others lack. And so you can't, I mean, it's impossible for policymakers to actually end up developing policies that make sense and that are workable without working with companies, because policymakers just don't know enough. These are too new, evolving too quickly. So I think as an interim step, self-governance, cooperation between public and private sector makes a lot of sense. It can't be the end stage. And so we still need to do the work to get to that end stage. But as an interim step, I think there's a lot of value to it.
Great. And also, I think that following up on your comment on who do you hold accountable and the way in which the Colorado AI Consumer Protection Act is looking to holding both the developers and the deployers accountable for algorithmic discrimination systems, I thought it was interesting that they incorporated an affirmative defense for those that showed that they were complying with the NIST risk management framework, or they said other industry-wide acceptable systems of risk management. And your thoughts on whether or not that is something that we're going to see more of?
I think in the immediate term, yes, we're going to see more of that. Because I think when companies are told they're going to be held liable, they naturally ask, okay, what do we have to do to avoid that liability? And because right now we're not in a place where you can guarantee that a system isn't going to come up with a bad result in certain cases, I think the NIST framework or standards that are developed through industry standard bodies are sort of a convenient thing to point to as a safe harbor. Well, at least if you do these things that are laid out in this document, then that you can avoid liability that way. Again, I don't think that can be or will be the final answer, because at the end of the day, if someone does suffer from discrimination, they should be able to go somewhere and get a remedy for that. And simply, having companies say, well, we followed the NIST framework doesn't really do that. So it can't be the final answer, but I do think it's going to be an answer that people turn to for now because they don't have a better one quite yet.
And also in the absence of comprehensive and omnibus legislation for AI regulation in the United States, we're falling back more and more on these voluntary commitments, these public-private partnerships with these leading AI companies and big tech corporations in order to try to effectuate the type of regulatory change that the government would like to see. And you had mentioned earlier the voluntary commitments that the Biden administration had entered into with leading AI companies. And I was wondering if you could speak to the way in which AI regulation is particularly unique. We've seen this in much of the dialogue that we had throughout the day in these excellent panels. But the way in which AI regulation is particularly integrated, it is not just, I think, the type of regulatory regimes we've seen in the past because of the implications in data privacy and cybersecurity and data integrity and the ways in which it impacts and touches upon, for example, national security. You saw that as part of the integration of the ambition of the voluntary commitments.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's hard. It's complicated, right, for the reasons that you're saying, that it touches on so many different areas. And it's sort of, I think when you and I were talking earlier, you mentioned, Jack Balkin has sort of described it as, there are at least three different stakeholders here. There's the government, there's the technology companies themselves, and then there are the individuals and users who either use the systems or are affected by the systems. And it's almost like there's a negotiation or sort of a going on between all three of those. And so, the voluntary commitments are an example of a negotiation between the government and the companies to try to resolve in some ways. But government, the legislature is trying to pass laws or sort of trying to negotiate between all three stakeholders as well. And so it's a multiple stakeholders, multiple issues, as you noted. quickly evolving technology that a lot of people don't understand. Even the developers maybe don't always understand, as we were referring to the black boxes earlier. And so coming up with a regulatory regime is, in fact, challenging, even for people of good faith who really want to arrive at the right solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that because you noted the stalemate that we've seen in Congress at the federal level has led to a very active development of regulatory and legislative efforts at the state level, including the California, the Frontier Models proposed legislation, where the state legislature of California says we are just trying to incorporate what the companies, these leading AI companies, have already said that they're doing. And so why can we not just reflect that in the state law? But it's experienced a huge level of pushback. And so we'd love for you to talk a little bit about that law and whether or not you see that as moving into the future of AI regulation as a way in which we look at the model itself, the data foundation itself.
So a couple of observations. One, I think the debate around that bill is exemplified one of the debates we see around AI regulation more broadly, which is what are the risks that we actually need to be paying attention to? Because for some have said, well, the real risk for AI is that it takes over, it displaces humans, it allows for the creation of nuclear or chemical bombs or a new virus, and these kinds of doomsday safety risks. And to some degree, the people who were proponents of that California bill were talking about those risks. Whereas I think for a lot of people, it's no, we should be talking about the current risks, the fact that it creates discrimination today, or that you've got snake oil being sold that actually doesn't accomplish what it is that the AI system is supposed to do. So you see that debate in this bill. You see the question you mentioned, originally, although I think that eventually got taken out, the bill called for the creation of essentially a new regulatory agency within California, the Frontier Model Division, to at least regulate the sort of foundational frontier models. And so this question of, do we need a new model of regulation, and you see that same debate playing out at the federal level, or do existing agencies, are they sufficient? You see that debate also playing out here. I mean, I think right now the betting is that Governor Newsom's going to veto that bill that you were talking about, and so it won't go into effect at all. But I think those same ideas you're going to see continue to be debating at the state level and maybe eventually the federal level.
Yeah, I think that it's really important for us to think about the ways in which the regulatory focus is changing, and especially with the introduction of generative AI. But you also see a very large movement I think an effort to try to look at antitrust law and the way in which we need to maybe look to the Digital Services Act or the Digital Markets Act of the EU as also the future of AI regulation, and was wondering your thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, I think there's obviously a real concern that we're replicating the same power in tech companies just through another generation of technology, right? That it's only the Googles and Metas and those large companies that are going to have the resources necessary to develop and train these really large language models. We're going to have access to the power, someone mentioned earlier, the electric power to be able to run those models. And the question of how do we make sure, is it antitrust laws or some other mechanism to make sure that the ability to develop and use AI is sort of not, again, concentrated in those small number of companies, giving them power over, as we'll talk about, the information environment or over our economy, and how do we prevent that, having seen how it played out in the social media context.
I think that that's a great segue for us to turn into a conversation about elections in particular. And that centralization of power and data, I think we've seen with the 2016 interference of our elections through foreign adversaries, and the way in which we have seen particularly cybersecurity vulnerabilities as a result of the Mueller report and the Mueller indictments, as well as the psychological operations aspect. The way in which the vulnerabilities within our social media systems to be exploited and capitalized by our foreign adversaries has been really troubling. I think we've also seen concerns with, for example, the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal, the ways in which social media can be captured for AI-driven voter micro-targeting that has been deeply concerning. So I was wondering whether or not you could help us to understand what you see as the future risks of AI in elections and what to degree that you've seen them manifesting themselves so far.
Sure. So let me highlight 3 risks that I think AI presents to our elections. One is what it does to our information environment. I think we've all heard about the potential for deep fakes, the use of videos, audio to portray someone having said or done something that they didn't do. In the election context, we saw that, for example, with the robocalls in New Hampshire that purported to be from Joe Biden telling people not to vote yet. And so you have the threat of deep fakes themselves, but I actually think it's a more pernicious threat, which is that it undermines trust in our information environment more generally and creates what some people call the liar's dividend. And there's actually a great example of that literally today here in this state. Yesterday, most of you may have seen that CNN reported about the gubernatorial candidate here, Mark Robinson, having participated in some porn sites and done some various types of activities. Today, what is his response? He said, "Oh, it's some billionaire who spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on AI to create this kind of material." And so he's using the lack of trust created by AI, the possibility that AI can create deep fakes and fake content, as a way of undermining what I think we all probably believe is actually true content and authoritative content. And so the fact that AI can be used to create this kind of fake content undermines trust in the information environment more broadly and makes it more difficult for ordinary people to know, can I trust this, or is this really true, even if it is authentic content. So I think that's one way in which AI has a profound effect on our elections, or potentially has. 2 is, you mentioned micro-targeting. I think the ability of generative AI to target misinformation and disinformation in a very personalized and hyper-local way brings disinformation and misinformation to a new level. So just to give you one hypothetical example, imagine on election day that using publicly available data about precinct sites and who belongs to what precincts, you have generative AI create a series of text messages in a particular precinct saying, hey, this school, which is your voting site, there's a fire going on, voting has been suspended there. And as a result, a bunch of people don't vote that day. And it's targeted to minority communities or to other particular communities. It affects the election, the outcome of the election. So that's another example of a way in which AI can affect it. And then a third way, which we just put a report out about, is the people relying on generative AI to get information about, for example, the time, place, and manner of voting, and generative AI producing incorrect information. We all know that generative AI sometimes generates hallucinations, isn't accurate. And so we just recently released a report focused on disabled voters and what answers do generative AI, 5 different generative AI chatbots, give to basic answers about voting with a disability. For example, for many disabled voters, they want to be able to utilize curbside voting, so they don't have to get out of their car and make it into the voting booth, but in fact can pull up basically in their car and vote on the curbside. Some states offer curbside voting, some states don't. It turns out that generative AI chatbots will generate the wrong answers and will sometimes tell voters in particular states, yes, curbside voting is available, so the disabled worker will go on an election day expecting to be able to do that. Turns out curbside voting isn't available, and so they have no way of voting because they hadn't made an alternative plan. And so that's an example of where inaccuracies in generative AI can prevent someone from voting. So those are 3 examples, I think, of the ways in which AI can undermine or really harm elections.
Thank you so much. I think that this is such a great week for us to be talking about this because of the recent activity we saw in California with Governor Newsom signing 3 election law and deepfake legislation laws into law. And I was wondering if you could help understand what approaches have we seen in addressing, for example, deepfakes in elections?
Yeah, so there are several different approaches being taken. One is just to, quote unquote, ban deceptive deepfakes, which in some ways is appealing. It also raises some significant First Amendment and free expression issues because deepfakes, for example, can be parodies or satire, which are protected information. And frankly, even under our First Amendment, even lies in general are protected by the First Amendment with some specific exceptions. And so coming up with legislation that actually can pass constitutional muster that deals with deepfakes has turned out to be quite challenging. Another approach that people are taking is the idea of watermarks or what's called content provenance data. In other words, have the generative AI companies, when their systems are used to generate a video or a picture, label it, watermark it. In other words, put some sort of indication this is AI generated, or attach some metadata to it that says this was generated by ChatGPT on this particular day. And then social media companies, who are the distributors of this information, can ingest that information and be able to label, for example, an AI-generated video as having been AI-generated. So when a user sees it, they at least know that the video was AI-generated and isn't a real video. So that kind of technical solution, it's complicated because it requires a lot of cooperation across companies, a lot of standardization. But in fact, a lot of the big companies are actually working on this. I don't think it's going to be in place in time for this year's election, but I think a solution like that is going to be part of the solution down the road.
Now I want to switch to the topic of the intersection between elections and national security and data and AI governance. And what we see is increasingly this administration seeing data privacy not as a consumer protection issue, or cybersecurity not as a consumer protection issue, but really something that implicates these larger national security strategies. And we see that, for example, with the executive order on prohibiting the sale of bulk sensitive data. So looking at data privacy law and that intersection with how data can really be seen as almost dual-use technology, something that has civilian capacities, but in the world of AI weaponry and AI warfare, suddenly data means something very different when you're looking at it strategically from a foreign policy perspective. We also saw, for example, in the last week or so, the DOJ indictment of the RT employees and the allegation that approximately 10 million in advertising that was bought on our social media platforms in the United States was used to propagate Kremlin propaganda. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the way in which AI and the lack of regulation might be impacting our national security.
Yeah, and I actually think of this as sort of a two sides of this. There's one side is, as you note, the weaponization of data and AI systems in ways that can harm people. In the same ways that we've talked about the use of AI to weaponizing data to discriminate against people. It can also be used, by adversary countries to harm people or to learn more about them and then use that data or what you learn to, for example, pressure them to do something contrary to the interest of the United States, or the use, of AI really to engage in cyber attacks and things like that. But there's the flip side, I think, also from a national security standpoint that I think is interesting and relates to this democracy question, which is that we also are going to use AI for our national security, right? Whether it's autonomous weapons. Literally today, Chuck Schumer in the Senate introduced an amendment to the National Defense Act that is called the AI-Enabled Weapons System Center of Excellence. And, as the name implies, it's about developing, AI systems, AI weapons, AI-based weapons. And I think the use of AI in that way, purportedly on behalf of our country, really raises foundational democratic questions, which is how do we ensure that when the government uses AI weapons to kill somebody, to target someone, to kill them, to decide who to surveil, to decide who to let into the country as part of our immigration system, how do we ensure that those uses of AI are actually subject to democratic accountability and control by people as opposed to others? Because in the national security context, I think the challenge is particularly hard because national security is inherently secret, right? I mean, there are legitimate reasons to keep certain things secret, classified. It's just sort of inherent in the notion of national security. But if you're going to then use in that secret context these AI systems that themselves may not be really subject to transparency, that may be black boxes, that are used in ways we don't know about, then how do we ensure oversight and democratic accountability over the use of AI in that context? And I think that's a challenge that we're just beginning to grapple with. But it's, in some ways, a really profound challenge because it's the most basic liberties and rights are implicated by national security. I mean, it's literally a matter of life and death in some cases, or basic surveillance. And and if you're going to use AI systems to engage in that, what are the rules of engagement there? How do we ensure that humans are actually in the loop and the ones making the decision? How do we make sure that those kinds of systems aren't infected by bias and end up killing members of marginalized communities disproportionately just because of the bias? How do we, just from an effectiveness standpoint, it really doesn't actually help our national security if we're using systems that are ineffective or biased because it's targeting the wrong people. And so I think there's some really profound questions there from a democratic standpoint that we need to be thinking about.
Absolutely, and I think along those lines of how do you create democratically responsible AI systems and the types of regulatory regimes in order to try to reinforce and preserve our democracy is so complicated. And in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election, you had somebody from Russia basically saying that they were on the verge of creating the type of weaponry that would allow for Russia to speak with the United States as equals, and many people believe that that weaponry was in reference to information warfare and AI weaponry. And so in light of that, how do we try to preserve our democratic values? There are those that say that if we try to capture and use, for example, offensive AI weapons in an exact manner as our foreign adversaries, then we're at risk of then tearing down those values. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on how do we preserve democratic accountability when increasingly those types of accountability measures are harder and harder to try to understand?
I think this really gets at the heart of the question of the AI and democracy, right? Because we have a situation in which already I think a lot of people feel that tech companies have too much power, right? If we think about our information environment, it's Elon Musk in control of Twitter who controls a lot of what people see and talk about. Or Google, Meta, it's a handful of companies that have a huge amount of power over our democratic dialogue, over our political dialogue. And so, the question of how do you maintain democratic control already exists. Now we're going to layer on these AI systems which operate in ways that may not be transparent, that are going to be involved or actually make hugely consequential decisions, whether it's in the law enforcement context, the national security context, who gets a job, who gets a loan, who doesn't. And if those systems aren't themselves subject to transparency and democratic oversight and accountability by policymakers, and then through policymakers, us, how do we have democratic accountability around these increasingly powerful companies, these increasingly powerful systems? And I think it's a challenge that we haven't figured out yet. Because we've already seen it with the tech companies. I think it's only it gets significantly worse as AI becomes part of the picture as well. And I think that's really a profound fundamental question that we need to be grappling with.
Absolutely, and I think especially in light of what we've seen with the Facebook papers and Frances Hagan's coming forward with the way in which the monetization and commercialization of the data then really increases the incentives for polarization and for radicalization. And so in light of the business incentives to push us towards disinformation, misinformation campaigns, how do we have that accountability operate?
Right. Because, we're already seeing it with, even before AI, we're already seeing it with disinformation and misinformation, and the fact that it's, a handful of white men in Silicon Valley who exert so much control over our political dialogue. And, as I said, when you layer on AI systems on top of that, not only in the social media environment, but really throughout all these fundamental decisions in our economy and in our society, again, controlled by those same set of tech companies and in ways that are even less transparent, then you have some really difficult questions.
Great. I think that this is a perfect opportunity for us to throw it open to the audience and see if there's any questions. Thank you so much, Samir. Dessert. Any questions? Yeah, Trina?
This was just amazing. Thank you so much. I have so many thoughts in my head. I don't even know where to start. Let's start with Brandon's question, right? Why an AI Bill of Rights when we already have a Bill of Rights that offers protections, right? For so many of the concepts that you articulated that are the driving values behind the AI Bill of Rights.
I mean, in some ways, I think you can.
Optics, or is there some substantive force behind a separate Bill of Rights?
I mean, I think the use of the word Bill of Rights was intentional because I think they were trying to link and sort of say, in some ways you can think of it almost as a translation of some of the values in the constitutional Bill of Rights into the AI context and sort of say that, just as we have the Bill of Rights more generally, in the use of AI is going to be so profound, usher in so many profound changes, we need to think about sort of what are the equivalent or similar Bill of Rights that we need to make sure we're preserving as we introduce AI.
For example, privacy. It's not in our Constitution. It's not in our Bill of Rights. It's nowhere to be found. But privacy was one of the core pillars of the AI Bill of Rights. And I think that, just as Samir explained, it was intentionally introduced for us to focus our discussion on whether or not it should be there explicitly.
Well, it was a lot of food for thinking. And my name is Vinicius. I'm from Brazil. I'm a LLM student at Duke. And in Brazil, we're going through municipality elections this year. And, well, I don't know how it happens. I'm still catching up with all the events, but Twitter is kind of should be banned from Brazil, and Elon Musk kind of rendered a fight with the Supreme Court over there. So, getting the context of this big tech influence democracy and how all the systems operate, how do you see the role of courts regulating a matter that is not regulated and is still evolving so rapidly that when legislators decide what to put on paper, it's going to be outdated already?
Yeah, no, I think both of those points are important ones, right? I mean, I think the situation in Brazil between the court and Twitter is a good illustration of sort of the struggle for democratic accountability that I was talking about, right? Because the Brazilian judges' point of view is that Musk was undermining sort of the decisions that the Brazilian society as a whole had made about how elections should operate, what their information environment should look like, and he stood up to Musk and basically said, no, you don't have that kind of power. That's not your power to have. Now, at the same time, I think it did raise this question. Well, that may well be true. Musk is an illegitimate power holder here, but is it just a single judge who should be making this decision too? Or what is the legitimate way for society to exercise that kind of control? And and is the right answer essentially cutting off all of Brazilian people from the use of Twitter in legitimate ways, to engage in dialogue with each other and the like, and to engage in free expression? And so I think the question of how society should exert control in a democratic way, and what is the role of courts vis-a-vis legislators versus private parties themselves, I think is a question that's a difficult one to answer, and I think we're still trying to figure out. But I agree, it's not a simple, let the courts decide.
Eva?
Thank you. This has been really wonderful. I appreciate the very thoughtful questions, the very thoughtful answers. I'm generally more optimistic about technology, maybe because I'm a tech head and I love kind of playing around with tools. And I think at the end, I kind of felt this weight, and I'm feeling concerned. And I'd like to know your thoughts on, are you feeling optimistic about where we may possibly end up so that we do have the democratic accountability, so that we do have the necessary legislation and regulations? A lot of tough questions. I appreciate your candor, but as someone who's in the mix, right, when it comes to the policy and the deep thinking, guess what I'm hoping you will tell me is that you do have some optimism.
Not leave you too depressed for the weekend. I certainly think things will get better. I mean, I think as we grapple with this and as we understand it, I think we'll get more policies and more controls in place. I do think, in some cases, I think our information environment is fundamentally changed, and we're not going back. And so figuring out, okay, how do we deal with that? Is it a matter of education and people better understanding how to be skeptical, how to be resilient in the face of what they see, so that the moment they see a video, they don't just assume it's true, in the same way that I think historically we're both, as a psychological matter and just as a practical matter, do. So I think, but I think it is a lot of this is going to be a societal transformation that takes place over years, and not, I don't think next year we're going to say, okay, we're good. So I think things will get better. And obviously I've been focused on the sort of risk side of things, just given the nature of the conversation. Obviously, there's lots of ways in which AI can make things better, whether in medicine and otherwise, where we've seen it have, profound benefits. And so, in thinking about, what is the balance of AI, you can't ignore the benefits. And I've been focused more on the risks. And so totally fair to say, okay, well, there are a lot of benefits too, and there are. So I think you can't ignore that in thinking overall. But I think we have a lot of work to do still, I think, in grappling with the benefits and potential downsides too.
Okay,
this is a great presentation. Thank you so much for all of this. One thing you said earlier in the conversation was that one of the things we're most likely to see first from big companies is they're responding to regulations that are sort of implemented elsewhere, like in the EU or China, just because of the global nature of what they have to do. And so, considering that this is mostly company-led at the moment, my question is, how do we balance the necessity to respond to what's already being done internationally with what we would like to do ourselves? Is this an area where we're more likely to submit to what might be an international consensus that we've done in other areas, or is it somewhere where we're likely to try and assert something totally different?
That's a good question. I think that's one reason why it's good that there, in fact, are a lot of international discussions going on between policymakers. Certainly between the US and the EU, there's quite a bit of dialogue going on. And so, in some ways, what the EU is doing is not so different from the kinds of things that people are talking about in the United States. In I mentioned the NIST Safety Institute, that's doing a lot of work on sort of underlying science of measurement and some of the underlying science issues. And in fact, there are safety institutes in a lot of different countries, the UK, Japan, and others, and they're coordinating with one another. I think in November, they're actually all meeting together in San Francisco to coordinate and make sure that they're not doing overlapping or contradictory work. So I think there's a degree to which there will be a certain amount, there is in fact a lot of dialogue and there is some coordination. But at the end of the day, it's also true that different countries have different values and different, priorities. And, I suspect that for like-minded countries, by which I mean, some of our allies and the like, that will arrive at regulatory regimes that at least resemble one another, even if they differ in details. That's obviously not going to be the case in any foreseeable future between the US and China, for example. And that's, and companies, to the extent that they're global, are just going to have to live with that, I think.
Yeah, Chess.
This is great. This is really great. So I was thinking about the point about we need to develop some sort of data protection agency and what's happening at the state level and what could be at the national level. And you mentioned that it was happening, but I didn't quite get your sort of opinion on that idea. So I want to kind of push that back to you, because it's been something that I've had conversations with in working groups with privacy law scholars, and what would that look like, sort of the nitty gritty, and some of the questions you raised, what sort of expertise is needed if such an agency is developed? Where is it recruiting from? What sort of, is it going to be lawyers? Is it going to be tech people? I mean, it really boiling down. How do we get community participation? So anyway, a lot of good questions. So I wanted to push you on that, to sort of share a little bit about what your opinion is on that idea. And then the other thing I was I was thinking about is how do we, I don't know, I feel like so much technology with AI is pushed and deepened because we have this, I don't want to make light of it, but for like this boogeyman, and this is how, in terms of global geopolitics, like this is how Russia and China are using it. So we have to double down. We have to build this up, right? And how do we, even if we say that it's in the military complex, how do we stop that from spilling over into like domestic uses? And I think this connects to some of Margaret's work. You think about, what we do militarily abroad, being used in domestic ways. We're curious what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. So first on the question of, should there be a separate federal agency? So in my view, we should think of regulation of AI as sort of a matrix. There are going to be certain obligations that should apply across the board to AI, regardless of the context in which it's being used. There are other ways in which the regulation really just needs to be context specific. So that, there's a reason in the United States we have evolved different regulatory regimes for finance versus health versus other sectors. And I don't think the fact that AI is used in that sector at some level changes that. So, we're going to need health agencies who have the health expertise to be able to think about, okay, now that AI is being used in health, what are the rules that need to be applied? So I think you need sector-specific regulation around AI. So then the question becomes, okay, what about the horizontal stuff? Where does that reside? And I think that's a difficult question, and I'm not sure I know the answer yet, because to some degree, to the extent that horizontal stuff is technical in nature, like understanding how do we measure bias, I think NIST is actually the right place to do that because they have that kind of expertise, or they're developing that kind of expertise. And so, some of that horizontal probably can live in existing agencies. The FTC to some degree has that ability as well because they regulate across the economy. As a practical matter, standing up a new agency is just a really difficult thing to do, and getting them set up. DHS is its own monster, but it's taken 20 years, and DHS still isn't really functional in many ways. So I have some skepticism about the notion of setting up a separate agency. I think you'd have to think hard about what is it that agency needs to do that existing agencies aren't capable of doing, and it's not entirely clear to me yet. What that is. On the question of the military use, I think you're right. China very much is a presence in these conversations, and it's really a presence in both. It's certainly a presence in the military national security context, like we can't let China or Russia have the AI weapons and not have our own, or we're going to be subjugated to them. But it's also true in the commercial context that we're in this economic rivalry with China, and that if China is able to develop, the newest AI systems or quantum systems before we are, that we're going to be at an economic disadvantage to China. So, but to my mind, I think you can't beat China by becoming China, because the whole point of beating China, right, is because we think our values in our system of governance is better than that of China, right? Because we're worried about China's authoritarianism, the way in which the government has control. So if we beat them only by becoming them, then we've lost. And so the real question that we and our allies, I think, have is how do we, in fact, encourage innovation, but responsible innovation that's consistent with our values? And that, to me, is the challenge that we face. It's not don't do innovation. It's, yes, we need innovation, but how do we do it responsibly in a way consistent with our values?
Yeah, Jim.
Values has come up throughout the day, right? It's weaved itself, it's a recurring theme throughout, through each of the panels. And so on that point, when you mentioned, the values point, which is, well, who's the determinant of those values when it comes to creating even these, governance structures, right? Or thinking about, even to your point that, there has to be sector specific or, governance, if you will. But, how are those values being created from across the board, right? Or who is at the table to create those values? Particularly because as we've part of the reason why we're here today, at some point there's that impact on marginalized groups and folks who are not at the table.
Yeah, no, that's a really important question. I kind of think of it at two levels. There's the community engagement point that's been made earlier that I think is a really important one, is that if you're going to use AI systems in ways that are going to affect particular communities, that making sure that those communities are involved in the decision-making from the beginning is critically important. And I think more broadly, it relates to this question that we were getting to at the end, which is this question of democratic accountability, right? I mean, how in this country do we decide on and implement our values? It's through our democratic systems, right? It's through the Constitution, through legislators who represent us, it's through our courts. And those are the institutions on which we rely to sort of say, these are the values that we care about, and these are the ways we're going to implement them. And I think we have to do the same thing with AI, and I think my worry is that because of the power of tech companies, because of the inscrutability of some AI systems, that we need to make sure that, in fact, those same institutions, and through them, and through those institutions, us, are the ones who are deciding these questions about what are our values and how they should be implemented.
Any other questions? And if not, please join me in thanking Samir Jain.
Thank you.